What I am about to say does not concern the ordinary man of our day. On the contrary, I have in mind the man who finds himself involved in today's world, even at the most problematic and proximal points. Yet he does not belong inwardly to such a world, nor will he give in to it. He feels himself, in essence, as belonging to a different race from that of the overwhelming majority of his contemporaries. The natural place for such a man, the land in which he would not be a stranger, is the world of tradition. Hello, and welcome to episode 3 of the book club. Tonight we are covering Ride the Tiger, part 1 by Julius Evola. The excerpt is from the first page, and we're going to be going through the better part of the first 2 parts tonight, which I believe covers chapters 1 through 6. 1 through 11. We're covering 1 through 6. Part 2 is rather large. It's actually the largest part in the book. So we're going to break that in half, and we'll do the second half in 2 weeks when we cover part 3 and 4. We'll start that with the second half of part 2. We're going to work through essentially the introduction, and then we're going to get into some of the meat and potatoes that kind of draw together everything we've been talking about with the Apollonian and the Dionysian. Ironically enough, chapter 10 does cover Apollo and Dionysus, so that will be interesting when we get there. Most of what we're going to talk about today is the decline of the West, modernity, and it's essentially a diagnosis of modernity in the Western world and what Evola believes we can do to withstand the forces of modernity. Now, ironically enough, Evola is kind of a black pill and a white pill at the same time, because he doesn't think that there's anything you can do individually to kind of make things better. And he got this view largely after World War II. He was pretty disgruntled with both fascist Italy and Nazi Germany. For those of you who might not know, Evola was an Italian fascist, but he never really fully bought into the movement. He has a book called Fascism is Viewed from the Right, where he is pretty critical of fascism and Nazism. And the reason he was ultimately disappointed is because they weren't right-wing enough. So Evola is going to be one of the few thinkers in the world where he's going to look at the authoritarian regimes of the 20th century, and he's going to say, yeah, actually, they weren't right-wing enough. They didn't go far enough. And his reasons for thinking this are largely because any spiritual dimension they had was inauthentic, and it was largely used as a rallying cry for the war effort. And they didn't seek to transcend into any kind of more meaningful spiritual or religious context. We're going to talk about Evola a little bit in terms of his life, who he was, and that will be kind of intermixed. So without further ado, let us begin. So we're going to start with another quote from the book. So he says, "Nevertheless, a few men exist who are, so to speak, still on their feet among the ruins and the dissolution, and who belong more or less consciously to that other world of tradition. A little group seems willing to fight on, even in lost positions. So as long as they do not yield and do not compromise by giving in to the seductions of the world that would condition any success they might have, their testimony is valid. For others, it is a matter completely of completely isolating themselves, which demands an inner character, as well as privileged material conditions, which grow scarcer by day. All the same, this is the second possible solution. I would add that there are very few in the intellectual field who can still affirm traditional values beyond any immediate goal, so as to perform a holding action. This is certainly useful to prevent current reality from shutting off every horizon, not only materially, but also ideally, and stifling any measures different from its own. Thanks to them, distances may be maintained, other possible dimensions, other meanings of life indicated to those able to detach themselves from looking only to the here and now. So when Evola says traditional world or tradition, he uses it in the same sense as Rene Guénon, who was a French traditionalist and intellectual. And Guénon defines a traditional society essentially as when the guiding principles of the society transcend the merely human and are ordered from above, and they're in accordance with divine and natural law. And this is important because we don't do that. In fact, no culture on earth today really does that. And you might look to some tribal groups, some like uncontacted tribes who still have their ancestral religion or their ancestral practices. But for Evola, he would look at this and he would find it wanting, because these kind of tribal states, they're not transcendent. They're oftentimes very static in the way they behave, in the sense that they're not actively moving towards something bigger and greater. They don't have grand ideals. They don't have any kind of philosophical maxim that would push them further in terms of development or anything like that. And that's not to say technological development, but rather spiritual ascendancy. Because again, for Evola, everything's about spirit. There's a really funny meme that I will post in conjunction with this episode, and it has a peasant, and he's holding a stick and he's covered in dirt, and he says, "Perhaps we should improve society somewhat." And then it has Evola's face, and it just says no. And the the idea of a society ordered above the merely human, this implies a sovereign leader at the top who is spiritually grounded himself, who is able to be the arbiter of that divine and natural law on behalf of the nation. So no democratic process is going to be traditional, right? Like democracy or even republicanism as it exists today is a fairly new invention. Sure, we say we get it from the Greeks, we get it from the Romans, whatever, but we really don't. The type of democracy or tradition or democracy or republican values that they had are pretty different. Greece obviously had an overwhelmingly large slave class. Rome, same thing. And when the founders structured America, it was supposed to be that. But the problem with democratic processes, and the same thing happened for the most part in Rome, not so much in Greece, but the umbrella gets ever expanded outward as obviously the empire starts to run out of juice. And when you have full franchise democracy, it shortens the time preference for everyone involved. So you have leaders who think in terms of 4 or 2 or 6 year cycles, where the king is able to think in terms of lifetimes or even beyond, because, he wants to leave his kingdom in a good position for his son and for his grandchildren and so on and so forth. There are other problems with democracy in Evola's viewpoint that we will get to. let us continue. This is precisely the type of man that the present book has in mind. To him applies the saying of a great precursor: the desert encroaches, woe to him whose desert is within. He can, in truth, find no further support from without. There are no longer exist the organizations and institutions that in a traditional civilization and society would have allowed him to realize himself wholly. In order to order his own existence in a clear and unambiguous way, and to defend and apply creatively in his own environment the principles, value, and values that he recognizes within himself. Thus, there is no question of suggesting to him lines of action that, adequate and normative in any regular traditional civilization, can no longer be so in an abnormal one. In an environment that is utterly different socially, physically, intellectually, and materially, in a climate of general dissolution, in a system ruled by scarcely restrained disorder, and any way lacking any legitimacy from above, thence comes the specific problems that I intend to treat here. So again, there's the black pill, right? There, for if you're a traditionally minded person, there's nowhere for you to go in the West. There's no institutions seeking to aid you on your heroic path. There's no governments that you'll feel at home at. And, Evola stood trial after World War II for spreading fascist propaganda. And at his trial, he said, "I'm not a fascist. I've never been a fascist. I'm a super fascist." And he was acquitted, rather ironically, but it's true. He felt that even in a regime that, most of us on the far right would give anything for our countries to look like today, for someone like Evola, they were still totally lacking. They were completely materialistic for the most part. And, Evola gave a speech at the SS Castle, and they actually told him not to come back, because one of the things that he spoke about was how race isn't a purely biological thing. So if you look at the subtitle of this book, Ride the Tiger, the subtitle is A Survival Manual for Aristocrats of the Soul. And what Nietzsche means here, or sorry, not Nietzsche. We are going to talk about Nietzsche, Freudian slip there. What Evola is saying is that race and, your biological determining factors are downstream of your spiritual state. So, if you contrast this with a lot of right-wing movements in, say, the United States, a lot of identitarian movements, the sole basis is skin color, right? Like you think of like the white nationalist movement, not so much with like Nick Fuentes and his Groypers, or even if you go further back, like the alt-right. Now the alt-right was primarily an identitarian movement. But, if you were to go to Evola and say, "Hey, I'm white also, I'm European, let's band together and do something," he would say kind of, "Well, hold on now, what's your virtue? What's your spirituality? Are you materialistic? What do you know of philosophy? What do you know of your heritage? What do you know of your country? Are you courageous? Are you a warrior? Are you a philosopher? Do you have within you the archetype of the king?" And for most people, obviously the answer here is going to be no. And Evola has great respect for European society and for Europe as a whole. And one of the things he'll say later on in this book is that we shouldn't look to the East. And so we see a lot of people, especially today with like the New Age movement, everyone's turning to Eastern mysticism or Eastern religion, Eastern this, Eastern that. And while Evola has a great deal of respect for the Eastern tradition, he points out that, China went from an empire led by a sovereign to a full communist takeover and Mao in less than 100 years. And so in many cases where these liberal ideals, and I don't mean liberal in the sense of like the DNC, Nancy Pelosi, or some, blue hair college campus weirdo. I mean liberal in the sense of enlightenment, like the Enlightenment values, where these sorts of things have spread outside of the West. They've taken hold much faster and have progressed much further. So Evola says, it is worthwhile to look to the East and to see what traditions they may have. But, the East isn't coming to save us. And at the end of the day, we need to remember that we're European. So any of the things that are actually going to help us remain solvent, not in a fiscal sense, but in a spiritual sense, in a societal sense, are going to come from our own ancestors and from our own progeny. It's not something we can really look out at the rest of the world and seek refuge somewhere else, kind of like with race being downstream of spirituality. We know that civilization is downstream of ethnicity. It's downstream of race. And therefore, if you want to build a European society, a traditional European society, you have to look to Europeans to build that. Okay. My sticky notes are making my pages stick together. Lovely. Where's that happening at? There we go. Okay. In the first place, considering the general situation that becomes clearer every day since those crucial events that are the two world wars and their repercussions, to adopt such an orientation signifies self-deception as to the existence of material possibilities. The transformations that have already taken place go too deep to be reversible. The energies that have liberated, or which are in the course of liberation, are not such that can be reconfined within the structures of yesterday's world. Quick aside, this is something Spengler talks about, is how, once a civilization advances beyond something that it used to hold as true, you can't really put the toothpaste back in the tube. And, this is something I've spoke about in the past, how you have to create something new with tradition kind of as the inspiration for building something new. And we'll get into what Evola thinks that is here in a little bit. The very fact that attempts at reaction have been referred to, the very fact that attempts at reaction have referred to those structures alone, which are void of any superior legitimacy, has made the subversive forces all the more vigorous and aggressive. In the second place, such a path would lead to a compromise that would be inadmissible as an ideal and perilous as a tactic. As I have said, the traditional values, in the sense that I understand them, are not bourgeois values, but the very antithesis of them. All right. So he doesn't really elaborate on this here, what he's talking about when he says traditional values and how they're kind of against bourgeois values. But we actually just covered this with Nietzsche. So if you look at the aristocratic impulse or the elitist impulse, it's something like that is the greatest sin in a liberal society, is to be elitist, to be aristocratic, to believe in yourself and in your destiny, and to believe in your own virtue as opposed to that of the masses around you. And for Nietzsche, this is something that happened predominantly through language, right? Like we talked about how Nietzsche looked at as a philologist, he looked at the word for plain in German, schlicht, and saw that it also meant bad. And how the aristocratic elite of antiquity looked at the peasants and said, oh, well, these people are plain. Well, I'm not plain. Look at me. I'm in bronze armor, and I have horses, and I have good wine, and I have these higher ideals. I'm educated. And therefore, if they're plain and I'm not plain, well, clearly plain is bad. And so this is kind of what Evola is talking about there. He's talking about elitism. He's talking about aristocratic sensibilities. One is therefore obliged to turn to the opposite solution, even if things thereby become still more difficult and one runs into another type of risk. It is good to sever every link with all that is which destined sooner or later to collapse. The problem will then be to maintain one's essential direction without leaning on any given or transmitted form, including forms that are authentically traditional but belong to past history. So, when you get like, oh man, we just gotta, this is kind of like a rebuke of like the Ted Kaczynski model, or even like, oh, we have to return to insert thing you might want to return to, whether it's the 1950s or Germanic paganism or Catholicism, whatever the thing is that you say, oh, well, society was better when we all did this, so we should return to this. Well, that thing has already collapsed. It's gone. Maybe in a Catholic sense, if you're looking at the Catholic Church, you could say, oh, well, the Vatican's still there, and there's still a Catholic Church in my town or in my city. But does that Catholicism look like the Catholicism of old? Genuinely, like, this is something that I think I know a lot of Catholics. I used to attend a Catholic church, was confirmed Catholic. And, this was something that I wrestled with very deeply. And I know a lot of traditional Catholics do as well. I don't want to turn this into a let's bash the trads episode. But when you genuinely look at the world of Catholicism or, neo-paganism, any of these sorts of revivalist movements, do you genuinely see the thing they're trying to reconstruct in it? Now, maybe you do, and you're able to, build something meaningful out of that, and that's awesome. I myself attend an Orthodox Christian church. But we're here to talk about Evola. The advice, don't go to the place of defense, but to the place of attack, might be adopted by the group of differentiated men, late children of the tradition, who are in question here. That is to say, it might be better to contribute to the fall of that which is already wavering and belongs to yesterday's world, than to try to prop it up and prolong its existence artificially. It is a possible tactic and useful to prevent the final crisis from being the work of the opposition, whose initiative one would then have to suffer. The risk of such action, of course, are more than obvious. There is no saying who will have the last word. But in the present epoch, there is nothing that is not risky. This is perhaps the one advantage that it offers to those who are still on their feet. So here he's advocating for political accelerationism. Like, it might be better if those who are fascistically minded or traditionally minded can aid in any way, shape, or form of collapsing the current structures that they occupy, rather than he's not talking about like armed revolution or anything. He's whatever your whatever you can think of that would I guess materially like increase the GDP. Like maybe you would qualify for something like food stamps, but for whatever reason you don't get on them. Well, according to Evola here, maybe doing it would be a good idea because you are, one case kind of looking out for yourself, but you're also adding to the debt ceiling of the crumbling empire. All right, so that is how he concludes chapter 1. Kind of a basic introduction. Now we get to chapter 2, the end of a cycle, ride the tiger. The idea just mentioned refers to a perspective that does not really enter into the argument of this book, because it's not concerned with the interpersonal behavior, but with outer circumstances, not with present-day reality, but with an unpredictable future upon which one's own conduct should in no way depend. This is a perspective already alluded to, which sees that the present time may, in the last analysis, be a transitional epoch. I will say only a little about it before approaching our principal problem. The reference point here is given by the traditional doctrine of cycles, and by the idea that the present epoch with all its typical phenomena corresponds to the terminal phase of that cycle. The phrase chosen as the title of this book, Ride the Tiger, may serve as a transition between what has been said hitherto and this other order of ideas. The phrase is a Far Eastern saying, expressing the idea that if one succeeds in riding a tiger, not only does one avoid having to leap on it, but if one can keep one's seat and not fall off, one may eventually get the better of it. Those who are interested may be reminded of a similar theme found in the school of traditional wisdom, such as the ox herding episodes in the Japanese Zen, while in classical antiquity there's a parallel in the trials of Mithras, who lets himself be dragged by a bull and will not let go until the animal stops, whereupon Mithras kills it. This symbolism is applicable at various levels. First, it can refer to a line of conduct in the interior personal life, then to the appropriate attitude in the face of critical, historical, and collective situations. In the latter case, we are interested in the relation of the symbol to the doctrine of cycles, with regard to both the general structure of history and the particular aspect of it that refers to the sequence of the 4 ages. So the 4 ages are described by Hesiod. So you have the Golden Age, the Silver Age, the Bronze Age and the Iron Age. And this isn't talking about our own historical kind of understanding of like antiquity being the Bronze Age, because the swords were made out of bronze, and the Middle Ages are the Iron Age because the swords were made out of iron. That's not what he's talking about. What he's talking about is in the Golden Age, you had heroic, like essentially demigod-like kings, and these kings occupied both the warrior and the priest caste simultaneously. They were the bridge from the material plane to the heavens, and they were able to rule justly and heroically. And then you go to the Silver Age, which is the age dominated by the warriors, and the higher purpose of warfare and things like that were kind of lost. And then you had war for the sake of honor. And then you get to the Bronze Age, which is the age of the merchants. And then war is fought for monetary reasons and for resources and things like that. And then the Iron Age, or the Wolf Age, as it's also sometimes called, because this is a perennial idea. I believe it's talked about in the Havamal. I know for sure it's talked about in the Eddas. This whole cycle is something that Odin says in the Eddas has happened 6 times. And then obviously we're all familiar with the Kali cycle, with the Surf the Kali Yuga and all that. So what Evel is saying here essentially is that we are in the transitional epoch. We're in the Kali Yuga now. And so what follows that is another golden age. It is also worth noting that none of us will be alive to see that, as all of recorded history, according to Evola, has taken place in the Iron Age or the Kali Yuga. And so within each age, it's kind of like concentric circles. Within each age, there are shadows or aspects of the other ages. So each civilization goes through its own cycle of Golden Age, Silver Age, Iron Age, or Bronze Age, Iron Age. And likewise, so too does the planet. And then also you will in your own life. It's kind of like macrocosm mirrors the microcosm, or as above, so below. It is worth pointing out that Evola was a rather renowned occultist. Wrote many books on the Hermetic tradition. He has an Introduction to Magic, volumes 1, 2, and 3. He has The Mystery of the Grail, which we might cover at some point. It's like essentially the initiatic quest for Hermeticism as told through like the esoteric teachings of the Arthurian cycle. He has The Path of the Cinnabar, which is his autobiography, which is all about his journey into and through occultism. Meditation on the Peaks. There's a lot of Eros and the Mysteries of Love. Like he wrote more on spirituality and occultism than he did political doctrine. And that's one thing he says here in the outbreak of chapter 2, where he's not really going to concern himself with what to do politically, because ultimately Evola, like so many of us today, thinks that there is no political solution. And that's not to say that it's not worth getting involved in politics, but for Evola, you want to kind of like do politics with a bit of how do we say it, like with a little bit of disassociation, essentially. Like any political means or political action that you get involved with at any level needs to be done for the sake of your own heroic path and not for some kind of grand transformation that is going to fix society or the world. Because ultimately things are going to happen as they happen. And while you have control over your own life and your own journey, and to some extent you might even have control over a local or national or global cycle, think of how much even someone like Donald Trump wanted to fix things or do certain things in office and has been totally unable to do them. I mean, hell, any president, right? Like Obama wanted to close Guantanamo Bay and ended up sending more people there than Bush. Now, how much of this is because politicians lie or because they get in and they get sat down by, the reptilians, as David Icke would say, and they're told, yeah, you're not going to do that. I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. But I do know that for Evel, it doesn't really matter. Okay. And with that, we're going to close out chapter 2 of part 1, and we will start part 2, which begins with European nihilism and the dissolution of morals. For the symbolic expression of the complex process that has led to the present situation of crisis in matters of morals and the vision of life, the best formulation is that of Nietzsche: God is dead. For our purpose, we can take Nietzsche's theme as our point of departure, because it has lost nothing of its validity and relevance. It has been rightly said that Nietzsche's personality and thought also have a symbolic character. Robert Reininger writes, "This is a struggle for the sake of modern man, that man who no longer has any roots in the sacred soil of tradition, wavering in search of himself between the peaks of civilization and the abysses of barbarism, trying to find a satisfactory meaning for an existence completely left to itself." Friedrich Nietzsche is the one who best foresaw European nihilism as a future and a destiny which proclaims itself everywhere by the voice of 1,000 signs and 1,000 presages. The great event, obscurely suspected, that God is dead, is the principle of the collapse of all values. From this point, morality is deprived of its sanction and incapable of maintaining itself, and the interpretation of justification formerly given to all norms and values disappear. Dostoevsky expressed the same idea in the words, "If God does not exist, everything is permitted." The death of God is an image that characterizes the whole historical process. The phrase expresses unbelief turned into a daily reality, a desacralization of existence, and a total rift with the world of tradition, that beginning in the West at about the period of the Renaissance and humanism, has increasingly assumed the character of an obvious and irreversible state of affairs for present-day humanity. So, obviously, the horse has been beaten well beyond what is necessary when it comes to, well, maybe not. It's definitely been beaten, though, when we say the death of God and, we talk about Nietzsche. From the fedora tipping Redditor who snidely says to the Catholic grandma on Facebook that God is dead, to the university philosophy department. Everyone loves reminding everyone that God is dead. And Evola's perspective is that no, God isn't dead. This isn't any kind of expression about the state of God himself. This is an expression for society at large and the moral and ethical collapse of specifically Western civilization. But as we spoke about a little bit ago, it's something that kind of applies to any civilization at this point who has adopted Western values, which is everywhere. The interesting thing that, Evola kind of points out here in the sense that well, he says, from this point, morality is deprived of its sanction and incapable of maintaining itself. What he means is that a civilization that doesn't have transcendent belief at its core, that's what he's talking about. He's talking about how the Western world, by denying any form of transcendent reality, any kind of transcendent hierarchy, is essentially a usurper to the peoples and lands that they claim to rule. And despite how it may seem, despite the black pill, any society that isn't transcendent is not long for this world. We must distinguish various stages of the process in question. The elementary fact is a fracture of an ontological character through which human life loses any real reference to transcendence. All the developments of nihilism are already virtually contained in this fact. Morality rendered independent from theology and metaphysics and founded on a sole authority of reason, so-called autonomous morality, is the first phenomenon to take shape after the death of God, trying to hide it from consciousness. Even Nietzsche says, the blood is on our hands. How can we ever be worthy of the deed? And so the first thing a society tries to do when it loses any kind of transcendent valuation is to trick itself to say, no, we have morality right over here. Look, we just codified it into law. Or, oh, what do you mean you need God to be a good person? That's essentially what he's getting at. As far as autonomous morality, this can kind of be broken down by understanding Kant with deontology, or the categorical moral imperative. So if lying is wrong, then lying is always wrong, and it doesn't matter your circumstance. So the one kind of example everyone likes to use is you're hiding Jews in Nazi Germany, and the SS walk up to your door and say, "Oh, you're hiding the Jews here," and then you say, "No, they went that way, sir," and then they run down the road. Kant would say, "Well, you lied, so therefore it's wrong. You shouldn't do that. You should tell them the truth." And obviously, we know that is not the case. That morality, bless me, that morality, while it may be universal in its nature, it's not universal in its applications. This is why the law makes a distinction between murder and self-defense. Okay, where were we? When the level of the sacred is lost, the absolute principle descends to the level of pure human morality. This defines the rationalistic phase of the stoicism of duty and of moral fetishism, which incidentally is one of the characteristics of Protestantism. In speculative philosophy, this phase has as its sign or symbol the Kantian theory of the categorical imperative, ethical rationalism, and autonomous morality. But once morality has lost its root, which is the original and effective relationship of man with a higher world, it ceases to have any invulnerable foundation, and the critics soon have the better of it. In autonomous morality, which is secular and rational, the only resistance to any natural impulse is an empty and rigid command, thou shalt, that is a mere echo of the ancient living law. Then, at the point where one tries to give this thou shalt some firm content, and to justify that content, the ground gives way. There is no support for those capable of thinking it through to the end. This is already the case with the Kantian ethics. In reality, there is no imperative at this stage that does not imply the presumed axiomatic value of certain unexplained premises that depend simply on a personal equation or on the accepted state of affairs in a given society. The phase of dissolution that follows that of ethical rationalism is defined by utilitarian or social ethics, renouncing any intrinsic or absolute basis for good and evil. The justification proposed for what is left of moral norms is whatever suits the individual for his own advantage and for his material tranquility in social life. But nihilism is already visible behind this morality. So again, you see the ever broadening kind of war to include all people. That's essentially what he's getting at here, is the just let people enjoy things. Or Jesus had like one vague rule and it was just be cool, dude. That is nihilistic morality. It's, I don't want to be confronted with duty and higher ideals of honor and virtue. So, like, I don't get heaven because God is dead, bro. So just let me do this thing that I want to do and leave me alone. And you kind of see that again when you had, like, in 2015, when you had gay marriage legalized. There was this sense that, oh, who cares what two consenting adults do in the privacy of their own home? And because the thou shalt of the moral thing that prevented that from happening, the lawgiver isn't present to give the command. You pull from an ungrounded morality, and then as more and more people want to fit in with the status quo, because again, you can't be elitist in a liberal democracy, that gets expanded to the point where we're at today, where transing your kids is fine and doing all these like weird things is fine, and you can't say anything about it or you'll get fired. It's because we have a nihilistic morality that isn't governed by God or the priest class or a sovereign king who seeks to uphold the transcendent functions of the spiritual life for his constituents, but rather you have a sort of leveling out of the moral structure down to the lowest common denominator. Nothing any longer has an intrinsic norm and an imperative character. It is just a matter of adjusting to society's codes, which takes the place of the superseded laws of religion. After Puritanism and ethical rigorism, this is the orientation of the bourgeois world, towards social idols and conformism founded on convenience, cowardice, hypocrisy, and inertia. But the individualism of the end of the 19th century marked in its turn the beginning of an anarchic dissolution that rapidly spread and intensified. It had already prepared the chaos hiding behind the facade of apparent orderliness. The previous phase, limited in its extent, that had been that of the romantic hero, the man who feels himself alone in the face of divine indifference, and the superior individual who, despite everything, reaffirms himself in a tragic context. He breaks accepted laws, but not in a sense of denying their validity. Rather, he claims for himself exceptional rights to what is forbidden, be it good or ill. The process exhausts itself, for example, in a man like Max Steiner, who saw in all morality the ultimate form of the divine fetish that was to be destroyed. He denounced the beyond that exists within man and that tries to give him rules as a being, a new heaven, that is merely the insidious transportation of the external theological beyond, which has been negated. Sorry, lost my page. That has been negated with this conquest of the interior God and the exaltation of the unique, that is free from rules and rests its case on nothingness, opposing itself to every value and pretense of society. Steiner marks the end of the road trodden by the nihilistic social revolutionaries, to whom the term nihilism was originally implied. But trodden in the name of utopian social ideals in which they always believed. Ideals such as justice, liberty, and humanity, as opposed to the injustice and tyranny that they saw in the existing order. Turning to Nietzsche, the European nihilism that he predicted as a general, not just a sporadic phenomenon, attacks not only the field of morality in a strict sense, but also that of truth, of worldviews, and of ends. The death of God is associated with the loss of any meaning to life, any superior justification for existence. Nietzsche's theme is well known, that a need for evasion and a surrender of life have brought about the invention of a world of truth, or a world of values, separate from and in opposition to this world now characterized as false and worthless. On these terms, all that remains real is what has been negated or rejected from the point of view of the other, superior world of God and truth, the world of what ought to be, not of what is. The conclusion is, what ought to be is not, what is what ought not be. This is what Nietzsche called the tragic phase of nihilism. It is the beginning of the misery of man without God. Existence seems devoid of any meaning, any goal. While all imperatives, moral values, and restraints have fallen away, so have all supports. Once we find a parallel in Dostoevsky where he makes Krylov say that man invented God just to be able to go on living. God, therefore, is an alienation of the I. The terminal situation is given in drastic form by Sartre when he declares that existentialism is not an atheism in the sense of being reduced to proving that God does not exist. Rather, it says that even if God existed, nothing would change. Existence is reduced to itself in its naked reality, without any reference point outside itself that could give it a real meaning for man. Thus, there are two phases. The first is a sort of metaphysical or moral rebellion. The second is the phase in which the very motives that had implicitly nourished that rebellion give way and dissolve for a new type of man. They are empty. That is the nihilistic phase in the proper sense, whose chief theme is the sense of absurdity and pure irrationality of the human condition. So, sounds like a black pill. But if you read between the lines there, Evola is describing our enemies. He's describing the people that those of us who are traditionally minded are fighting against. And I don't know if you caught it, but in the end, we win.